Good morning, everyone. I'm Sarah McDermott. I am the Safeguarding Adults Board Manager. I'd like to welcome you to this learning event today. The event is in relation to the Safeguarding Adults Review recently published in relation to PETA. And obviously the Safeguarding Adults Board has a responsibility to undertake safeguarding adults reviewed in circumstances. Today we are bringing together the learning to the wider system and also looking at practice development from agencies. We'd like you to take learning back to your agencies and see if there are any areas that you can work on. In regards to the agenda, I'm just putting the agenda up now. You'll see we've got a variety of speakers from different agencies. Some of those were involved with working with PETA, and we also have the author here, Fiona Bateman, of which we're very grateful to have here. So I'm now going to hand over to Fiona. We will have time, as you see, for some questions during the day and a short break as well, but we will enable the chat function as well at some stage for you to put any questions in the chat. So handing over to Fiona.
Morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. I have to say, you shouldn't be grateful for me being here today. It's been a real pleasure and a privilege to work on the PETA and to be involved at this stage where you guys are talking, the agencies that are going to be talking in a moment, be talking about the lessons they've learned and how they've implemented the review. Rare for an author to be allowed the opportunity to kind of see whether their advice has been accepted. So I am really grateful. I also had the privilege when I was working on this case to meet with PETA's children who were very involved in the case. They were really clear in their praise, particularly for the Hope Hub and the staff that worked with the Hope Hub around the way in which they had tried to work with PETA. And one of the things that we often find with reviews is that there are lots of opportunities for improving practice. And of course, we'll be talking about that today. But what I was impressed by was the energy and effort and the systems that you do have in place in Surrey to support those with co-occurring conditions. I'm using the term co-occurring conditions to mean more than one thing, effectively, more than one issue that might prevent somebody from being able to protect themselves. So I was asked by Surrey Safeguarding Adult Board to look into Peter's death. He fell at a train station accidentally. Now, at the point where he died, there had been for some time a team around the person. So a team of people looking at how to work with him to protect him from the risks that people knew could occur because of his a long history of homelessness, substance misuse, and the physical and cognitive decline that he was experiencing that were attributed to his dependency. These are not easy issues. And Surrey and the team around PETA found themselves in a situation that many people up and down the country, as professionals, as family members, face day in, day out. What we were looking at, really, I suppose if I could just talk a little bit about PETA, he did have a long history of homelessness, of rough sleeping. Alcohol dependency was a very significant risk, and his physical and mental health had very much deteriorated as a consequence of that. He'd lost quite a number of tenancies or housing options as a consequence of behaviours when drunk, and was subject to criminal justice processes quite a few times, including 3 times during the process. He was, however, as was described, a lovable rogue. Somebody who a lot of people cared a lot about. When he hadn't been drinking, he could be incredibly generous and incredibly thoughtful. He helped the Hope Hub, for example, shape their adult learning offer, and was really involved in supporting others in similar situations to himself. So he had the backstory. And everybody does, I suppose, is the key thing. He was released 2 days after being released from prison. And whilst the arrangements for his accommodation when he was released from prison were not ideal, for reasons that we'll go into in a little while, it has to be said that agencies pulled together with very little time to ensure that he didn't get released from prison onto the streets. So there was a lot of good practice that was seen throughout this. We covered the period of November 2019 to his death in October 2021. We started in November 19 because he had been assessed by adult social care at that point at risk of exploitation and needing care and support to prevent harm arising from self-neglect. So we looked at, you know, whether or not people understood the team around the person, the organisational structures, understood those organisational duties to work together, how effective and well coordinated his care was at key points of transition, and the response, the multi-agency response to recognising and responding to prevent harm when his mental health deteriorated. As I say, his family were really involved. They were with him and had some very clear and consistent messages that they wanted this review to express. But the thing that really touched me as a reviewer was that they recognised the work that had gone on to support him. They had a lot of questions. They questioned why, for example, that they weren't involved more frequently, that they weren't asked questions, because they felt that they could have identified for professionals that his cognitive functioning was deteriorating significantly. And they felt that really there should have been much more of a careful focus from health around his the potential for him to have a Korsakoff syndrome be an issue, or a similar neurological condition. I've only got a few minutes, so I'm not going to talk for very long, because I do want to give as much opportunity to agencies' presentations, because what happens next is the most important part of any SAR. But really, one of the things we wanted to highlight with this review was that the team around Peter absolutely recognised his vulnerabilities, but their attempts to support him were frustrated from the legal powers to compel him to accept support offered, his own ability to consistently engage with these, you know, service expectations around, you know, turning up for appointments, and whilst the Hope Hub and others were relatively flexible, I mean, the Hope Hub were incredibly flexible given the limitations. This was all through the COVID period, remember. But there was also a frustration in the lack of commission reserves to offer accommodation-based support. There was also a lack of clarity around the escalation. So if you are all of a view that actually you need something more than you've got in your current toolkit to work through and help manage someone's very complex needs, how you get that support to you know, and the legal powers to think about other options from higher up the organisational structure, if you like. And so we made a recommendation around or finding around multi-agency working that organisational network that supports frontline practice really needs a lot of strengthening, as does legal literacy. So we wanted to kind of really kind of think and focus our recommendations on that oversight of multi-agency risk management. Likewise, the planning for transitions. There are very good protocols in Surrey. The SAM approach, the Surrey Adult Matters approach, is a really good one. Really good evidence of good practice between the local authority and partner agencies, but there were inconsistencies in some respects. And others will talk about that and their learning from this in much more detail. Ensuring continuity of care for adults moving between hospital and prison or different local authority or geographical boundaries is incredibly difficult, but it was made much more so because of the complexities of responding to Peter's needs. So, for example, because he was often found to lack capacity in respects of certain aspects of his life, that meant that he had to be placed in emergency accommodation because that was all that was on offer, or all that the housing department could offer if he was deemed not to have capacity to apply for housing and therefore be offered a more permanent accommodation. As a consequence of that, he had to be placed out of borough, which made it very difficult for the social care services to be connected. So all of these issues interplayed for Peter and interplayed for the team around him. And I think that is one of those critical things that why a really good approach for Peter didn't quite work. And self-neglect, again, an area where up and down the country, in almost every part of our system, people are really having to grapple with some very complex issues, needs, and sometimes without the very clear legal framework as to how you balance those competing needs sometimes. But the system that you have, the SAM approach, the Surrey Adult Matters, is one that encourages system-focused, rights-based approach, multi-agency assessment, care planning. It was in its infancy. I can't stress enough just how hard this would have been to implement during a COVID pandemic. But there were really clear attempts throughout the case notes, throughout the paperwork, as to that kind of, flexing probably doesn't do it justice. There was a huge amount of work that was to try and make this happen. But very clearly, things were done, particularly in the context of his last prison release, were done at very much last minute because of probably workforce capacity issues, and that really made it much harder for the team based in the community to respond well. And there was opportunities missed to share information. We talked in this instance about the real need to kind of explore capacity assessments, not as a case of like we're doing this in an issue specific. I mean, the lawyer in me would like to say, of course, whenever you do a capacity assessment, it is issue and time specific. But the point is that when you've got a team around the person, as you did in Peter's case, to work with that team to understand what that assessment might do in respect of other people's powers within that team. There is, I hope, a nice section within this report, the main body of the report, that talks you through how one person's capacity assessment in respect of one aspect impacted on other partners' powers to do X, Y, and Z, which wasn't fully understood or explored within that team around the person. And that is something that I think as that grows in maturity and becomes more firmly embedded as practice across your systems, that hopefully will become more natural and you'll be all more comfortable to do that. It's much more around kind of ensuring that somebody doesn't fall through the gaps when you're passing things between different services. There's definitely a gap in services to support mental health of adults, not just in Surrey, but there is in Surrey, particularly those with established addictions who are not yet in crisis. So when you might respond when somebody's in immediate risk, not so good at kind of thinking through what that might need in terms of rehabilitation, in terms of supporting somebody to reduce the risk if they're not ready for abstinence. And as I say, the team around him understood that it would be unrealistic to expect that to be assessed just through his GP alone. So we really did think that a greater involvement of specialist services to provide advice and guidance, even if Peter was not ready yet to engage in complex programs around abstinence or around his mental health, that might have provided that extra guidance and support. And then just in terms of the recommendations, I won't go through these in huge length because, as I say, I know I've got another few minutes, but I think it's worth hearing from others. But really what we wanted to do was just increase the reach of the SAM approach to ensure that as it grows in a way that helps facilitate that multi-agency person-centred approach that is rights focused, by just providing more information, providing those escalation processes, and then ensuring also that there's feedback back to the SAM, the Surrey Adult Matters Steering Board, and to the Safeguarding Adult Board around the emerging themes or the safeguarding issues that are coming out of the work. because it's wonderful to do that work with each individual person. It's even better to then take the learning from those to then inform and continue to inform that system development. We talked about relevant partners delivering training and developing materials in line with the LGA's briefing on best practice in safeguarding and homelessness, and also Alcohol Chain's briefing on the legal powers to support adults with alcohol dependency. Mainly that's just about kind of really reinforcing that message that the law doesn't prevent you from doing anything. It's extraordinarily facilitative, but you do need to be comfortable and confident about how you balance those legal rights and how you utilise all agencies' powers to kind of plug the gaps that sometimes can occur. SAB are already working with the prisons in your area and probation and prison-based health staff. We thought it would be strengthen that work if they could develop protocols for sharing information and referral pathways into the SAM, into that team around the person. And also thinking more widely about robust information sharing and discharge processes, because at the point where Peter came from prison, having been in effectively a health ward or unit throughout his prison stay, that information was not passed back to the team around the person, and actually had it been, there would have been a recognition that his needs had significantly changed during that period of incarceration. We thought that there was a need to develop that obligations around continuity of care much more solidly and build that into the system, so that was better understood, and that could be built into strategically into the system through public health and social care commissioners reviewing data and thematic reports from the SAB. And then finally we asked the SAB, or rather we suggested that Surrey County Council and the ICBs should provide assurances to that Service Commission around specialist mental health and addiction support are available to provide advice to the team around the person. That is a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the case. As I say, it was a real privilege to work on it, to see the work that's already been done, and to see how this case might help illuminate the further development of that approach, because I think, well, chairing 2 boards elsewhere, I would absolutely adore to be able, if we could develop a similar kind of process in our areas, because I do think it's the right model, as you'll see from the next part of my talk. But I think if it's okay with Sarah, I'm going to pass to Dr. Raja. I think you're coming on next, is that right? So I will stop sharing and I'll pass over to you.
Oh, thanks. Thank you so much for providing that background. I'm going to start by sharing, and I hope that this works. Are you able to see my presentation? Yes. Yeah, okay. I'm just going to change the slideshow. Okay, so I'm Raj. I'm an old age consultant psychiatrist in Surrey and Borders. I'm also the old age safeguarding medical lead for the trust. What I thought I will do is that I will go through the presentation of this gentleman and try and make observations and comments about some of the medical aspects, including capacity and communication between health and various agencies as we go along, which may be easier than trying to list, and then I'll summarize the important bits at the very end, if that's okay. You have to bear with me because this is the first time I'm kind of presenting in this particular forum, so my format may not actually be readily understandable in that particular sense. So, and also feel free to ask or question me as we go on. I know it's 10-5 split, but I'm happy to take questions. Obviously, I can't see if you put your hands up, but feel free to shout out. So Peter, is reviewed under Section 44 of the Care Act of 2014. He is a 50-year-old, or he was a 50-year-old gentleman with multiple physical health conditions, and all of them mean a particular important facet to understanding of his presentation, as well as the difficulties and complexities in decision making, starting from the fact that he had a road traffic accident. He had an amputation, a below knee amputation that was done, and we will go on to find out that his ability to look after the stump was very, very compromised. He also had a subarachnoid hemorrhage, and later on, following from another incident, he had epilepsy, post-trauma, and then subdural hematoma. So for some of you who might start to wonder, well, he's had a lot of brain injuries over his lifespan, even preceding his alcohol use. I think it's important to understand the consequences of these things. So if we start with subarachnoid hemorrhage, this is a bleed, but this is a kind of a bleed that gets absorbed over a period of time, and same applies for subdural hematoma. The subdural being less of a complexity than subarachnoid hemorrhage itself. Dura and arachnoid refer to the layers of the brain covering, so any blood that collects in that particular area is subarachnoid hemorrhage and subdural hematoma. They are very static, isolated incidents. They don't leave a permanent damage to the brain, so most of the brain function will be recovered post an acute period of confusion, unless the hematoma itself is of long duration. It continues to be there in the brain, which I don't think was the case in this gentleman's presentation. Epilepsy is something that's prone to cause a lot of things, including cognitive impairment, depression. The trouble with epilepsy, especially in someone who is using alcohol, is that we would all be familiar with a delirious phase, which could also incorporate epileptic attacks. So then that makes it complex to understand whether the epilepsy was from the brain damage, or is this an epileptic attack from having an episode of withdrawing from alcohol as such. So it adds a lot more complexity to the presentation. So this gentleman had a history of alcohol abuse, which was impacting on his mobility, self-care, poor compliance with medication, going on to have behavioral disturbances, especially when he was intoxicated, leading to impact in terms of accommodation and criminal charges. Multiple agencies were involved. Mental health services were involved at the point that mainly he was admitted to acute hospital and required a mental health assessment. So he had been out for 2 days just before his death from prison. As Fiona set out, he was seen as a very colourful character. Despite his alcohol-related issues, his daughter in particular found him to be an adorable gentleman who was a valued family member. He also raised a very valid concern, and which I will try and talk through as we go, with regards to cognitive impairment and how it could have been assessed and what could have been done. So the year 2019 starts with him being in prison, at which point he's been evicted from his accommodation. He's been assessed by a social worker, and the understanding at that point of time was that if he was in a structured environment post discharge from prison and he was abstinent from alcohol, so very two important social factors, then perhaps he could manage his activities of daily living, and an appointeeship could be asked for if he doesn't object, and therefore it becomes very important to understand his capacity. We have talked, and Fiona has mentioned about how capacity is a moving beast with time and the specific issue. It becomes even more complex when we consider alcohol in the mix. In particular, he was assessed by a forensic psychiatrist in 2019. He was thought to be presenting with a history of alcohol dependence, and he was deemed to lack capacity within the domain of compliance with criminal behavior order. I think if we start to look at alcohol at this point in time, certainly all of us would be aware of cognition being impaired whilst people are under the influence of alcohol, as well as when they're withdrawing from alcohol. But there's also an important role that alcohol plays in terms of either fast-tracking the onset of what we would call as an age-related dementia, like an Alzheimer's type of dementia, or alcohol itself causing symptoms that would be very similar to an Alzheimer's type of dementia. But more commonly, alcohol will lead to very difficult situation where the person will be unable to recall important personal autobiographical memory. It goes by the common name, of course, of psychosis, which will get mentioned later on. But it's at this point, I think it's important for all of us to understand that there could be an acute cognitive impairment, either in the context of intoxication or withdrawal, and then there could be a chronic cognitive impairment where it fast tracks an Alzheimer's dementia, causes symptoms similar to Alzheimer's dementia, or can impact on autobiographical memory. And all of those things will need a specialist mental health service to look at, to diagnose, to assess, and to review over a period of time, which unfortunately did not happen in this person's presentation. So in January, he was released from prison, a lot of support, and I was really impressed. And as for someone who was reading this report, some of these services, I was getting used to them as I was reading through the report, and it's really, really interesting, especially the amount of work Hope Hub had played in keeping this man going. It's incredible, remarkable, I would say. In April, at the height of COVID, he was recalled back to the prison, and then following that, he was discharged, and accommodation was becoming a particular issue. Hope Hub continued to be the kind of played a pivotal role in trying to manage him. And in June, we're starting to enter the phase where there are concerns about is he being exploited, what is his level of support with accommodation, and he's starting to struggle with his activities of daily living and risk of self-neglect. I think it's important to understand that so once people start having cognitive impairment, whatever domain it is, whether it's short or long term, it will start to have impact not just as a mental health problem, but it will also start to impact on the physical health of the individual. And care of the stump for a prosthetic stump, it's very, very vital, because if it's not really looked after very well, especially if it was ill-fitting prosthetic like he had, then it will predispose to a lot of things such as skin tear, ulcerations, eventually leading to infections, which can then become even more complex to manage. And that was what he was struggling with. And I think his struggle was not just a physical struggle, it's just that it was almost a kind of subtle sign of saying that perhaps his cognition wasn't there for him to look after his I don't know, I'm not able to change. Oh, okay, good, we're back. In 2020, well, between September and December, he presented multiple times to A&E. The reason that he was presenting was that he was suicidal, and that is a very common presentation that he had, especially when he was under the influence of alcohol. Every time he had an assessment, the plan, it appears to be that and I think I would agree with it in the sense that it's important that he's sober when these assessments are carried out. So they always wait for him to become sober. A mental health act assessment would be carried out where he would start to become more rational, more logical, not having imminent suicidal risk. And he had always identified his family to be a strong protective factor. And at that point of time, he would not be admitted to a mental health unit for further assessments. I'm not entirely certain that during these assessments, a look at his cognition happened, and therefore, whilst he had multiple presentations, I think the question was whether he had that degree of cognitive screening even. I'm not entirely certain that happened. And I think it goes back to having an understanding of the Mental Health Act and good practice in terms of completing a Mental Health Act assessment, because good practice is that people should be seen by someone who's familiar with at least one of the doctors, or the social worker involved in the assessment should be familiar with the person, having had previous acquaintance, or at least from someone from a specialty who would understand, in his case, for example, the important interlink between alcohol and cognitive impairment. And that could have triggered a better understanding of his cognition and its impact, I think, especially when it comes to talking about his capacity to make very specific decisions. In the team around person minutes, there was some discussion about Korsakoff psychosis, but I could not see evidence of this being taken forwards in terms of either linking up with the primary care services to arrange for secondary care referral, or even alcohol services taking it upon themselves to ask for further cognitive assessment. February, March, again, he was becoming very vulnerable in terms of where he was and how he was looking after himself, especially becoming a vulnerable adult. And then the question becomes more and more prominent in terms of his capacity assessment. Now, all of us know that capacity assessment, for that to happen, there should be a mental disorder or disturbance. Now, alcohol dependence sits very uncomfortably in the area as to, does it actually cause mental disturbance or mental disorder? And that needs a bit of specialist workup in terms of understanding his cognitive symptoms, which I said could be acute in terms of withdrawal, intoxication-related cognitive impairment, to more kind of chronic symptoms like bringing forwards an Alzheimer's type of dementia, or presenting like an Alzheimer's dementia, or a very specific alcohol-related long-term memory damage. So the reason that it becomes important is that if it was started to present like an Alzheimer's dementia, then it would start to impact on his ability to retain any information that he was provided. If it was starting to present more like an alcohol-related long-term memory problems, then it would start to impact on his ability to weigh in information. And those are very crucial aspects of capacity assessment, which again, I think goes on to what Fiona was saying, in that if he was being seen by so many different teams, then all of them should have contributed to the to capacity assessment, best interest discussions. But equally, I think it would have been beneficial for him to have been seen by a mental health specialist to try and provide an opinion on the presence of mental disturbance or disorder, which whether it affected cognition or not. He was starting to increasingly become dependent on alcohol. He was once seen by the Criminal Justice Liaison Diversion Service, who did try their best to provide some psychoeducation about the impact of alcohol on physical and mental health. As I said to you earlier on, when it becomes difficult to manage the stump, then there's always chance of skin tear, ulcer. So they did want the GP to look at leg ulcer and consider for outreach. Then over a period of time, he does present increasingly challenging in terms of alcohol-related problems. So when he was seen in September, he was presenting in a state of delirium, and he was transferred to St. Helier for detox. But he then refused to engage with community-based services. He was seen by a psychiatrist. I think Korsakoff was perhaps considered, but I don't necessarily think, from reading through the report, that any specific diagnostic assessment or the impact of Korsakoff on his ability to make decisions was considered. And when he came out of the hospital, of the medical unit in prison, there was a discharge summary, but sadly this was not really passed on to community services, including his GP. So it kind of leaves us with the following points to discuss. So the role of diagnosis, yes, certainly. As I said, traumatic brain injury could have been a limiting factor at that particular moment in time, but not necessarily leading to long-term problems, but certainly alcohol-related cognitive impairment there should have been further assessment, further link up with neurologist or psychiatrist. And I should say at this point of time that COSCOV's alcohol-related cognitive impairment sits outside the scope of both secondary care mental health services and alcohol services. So it kind of sits in a very difficult space of being an uncommissioned aspect that we need to look up. So that is something that commissioners will have to look at in terms of how to deal with the diagnostic and follow-up arm of that. Legal paths. He did have capacity assessments, but it's debatable whether specialists who would have informed the capacity assessment in a better way, whether they're involved, perhaps not to the degree of a neurologist or psychiatrist being involved. But having said that, though, it would be difficult to argue that any different conclusion would have been arrived at in terms of this gentleman having capacity, and that is a very difficult thing to prove with alcohol dependence as well. So I'm not entirely certain that even if he was deemed to lack capacity, he went on to the point. It was to the extent where his liberties had to be curtailed to a very significant extent. So I would still think that he would have continued to have a similar kind of social environment as he had, irrespective of the depth of capacity assessment. But I think the capacity assessment would have been helpful in understanding and informing us about the extent of his cognitive impairment and therefore a proportionate involvement of services. Mental Health Act, again, you can't detain someone just because they're alcohol dependent. It's a question of how much more the alcohol has been in terms of causing mental health issues, so that needs to be considered. And all of that needs to be considered in terms of wider understanding of alcohol-related cognitive issues, alcohol-related cognitive issues then going on to impact on cognition. I think there needs to be a wider understanding of these two very important things. Equally being aware that because alcohol-related cognitive impairment doesn't sit neatly within mental health or neurological services or primary care, we have to start looking at a specific pathway and try and make sure that specialists from alcohol services, mental health and neurology are involved in it, and everyone gets discussed as part of this pathway if they do have an alcohol-related issue. So I'm going to stop at that.
Thank you for that. We are opening the chat to all attendees. So if you want to pop any questions in the chat to keep them until we have the question session. But chat is now open for questions for anyone to put them there so you don't forget them. But now moving on to Surrey County Council, Surrey Adult Social Care with Clement's going to present. So thank you.
Just firing up my slides. There we go. Hopefully you can see those now. So hi everyone, I'm Clement Gearin. I'm head of adult safeguarding for Surrey County Council Adult Social Care, and I was on the panel for the Safeguarding Adults review. So Fiona's covered lots of this. Yeah, high level a summary of some of the learning that came out from the review for us. I'm not going to talk about all these. I'm going to focus on something around our skills and knowledge and working with homelessness, people with ongoing alcohol use issues. But as a public body, everything we do is framed within public law. And I think it'd be useful to understand how we got to where we did with Peter, to give you some history. Everyone loves a bit of public law history, don't they? Isn't that what we all read at the weekends? So back in 1968, we had the Seaborn Report. So swinging 60s, Harold Wilson in government, it very much reflects the spirit of the time. It talked about bringing together family services into a single social services department, combined with housing, education, health departments, under the undivided responsibility of the same local authority. It didn't achieve it then, it's never been achieved since. Yeah, it's still a pipe dream, appropriately for Harold Wilson, it's a pipe dream. brought together all these services and the vision. You know, the end of this sentence here is it's a lovely vision of what this new social services department will do in the local authority, be enabling the greatest possible number of individuals to act reciprocally, giving and receiving services for the well-being of the whole community. A beautiful image. And I think for lots of people, in their common, will have a common sense view of that's what social services do even today. Maybe in some of us who that's what we thought we was signing up for when we joined the social services. But that's things have moved on since that vision. And 1988, you had the Griffiths report, which drove the Caring for People white paper in the NHS Community Care Act that came after it, with a very different vision. 1980s, yuppiedom. Big bang in the city, Thatcher government, markets are the solution for everything. Whatever the problem, the market is the solution. And so this is for most people who currently working in adult social care, this is a sort of framework that they've always worked within. So this is the purchase of provider split, the marketisation of social care. The role of the local authority is to commission at macro level, but for when working with an individual, you basically become a micro commissioner. You assess the needs and come up with the shopping list of what we're going to purchase for this person. But since then we've had the Care Act, and look at this. This has moved things on. So this is from the Care and Support Statutory Guidance that accompanies the Care Act. Assessment shouldn't just be a gateway to care and support. It's a crucial intervention in its own right. Those of us, you know, particularly like me, a social work background, social work is all about, relationship-based work to, and we believe in the infinite capacity of people to change and improve their lives, and that's what we do. And I think this is a nicely framed bit here around what the role of assessment is in this statutory guidance. It's not about the local authority understanding the person. It's about the local authority helping the person to understand themselves. What could be different? What's their situation? What do you need? How can things be different in your life? That's a lovely vision there. And just to go into a little bit of detail of the mechanics of how this assessment process works within the Care Act, local authorities have got to do three things in order. First off, you assess whether the person has care and support needs, and if so, what those are. And then for each of those needs, you reach a decision about eligibility. So that's a threshold decision. So this is just, does the need exist? This is to what impact it's having. And it's being eligible for the local authority to meet the need. That's what the eligible element is. And of those eligible care and support needs that the person has, the local authority is required to ensure that those are met, unless it can find a get out clause. So you've got to do all three things in order. And how do we meet these care and support needs? So Section 8 of the Care Act says, here's some examples, a non-exhaustive list of examples. The first one is very relevant for this review, but Fiona's done a sterling job at analysing that in her report. So I would encourage everyone to not just look at the summaries, go into the full report and read that section, because we could provide accommodation. Yes, we place people in care homes, but we can also arrange for other sorts of accommodation. There's all other sorts of things you might expect here, but counselling and other types of social work can be provided. We're probably not going to go out to the market and purchase those. That's probably talking about things we could do ourselves. But the Care Act didn't come with any increase in budget in order for us to do those sorts of things. So do we think of ourselves, does any local authority up and down the country think of itself as commissioning itself to provide social work? I'm not so sure. And how do we do this? We can provide, we can purchase, or we can give people the money to go to the market themselves. So this eligibility decision, we've identified whatever needs this person has. Which ones are the local authority required to ensure that they're going to be met? Three criteria need to be met. The need arises from or is related to a physical or mental impairment or illness. It's got to have two specific outcomes where the person is unable to do things. What those specified outcomes are is on the next slide. And is this having a significant impact on the person's well-being? There's a technical definition in Section 1 of the Care Act of what we mean by well-being, but your common everyday understanding of them is good enough for these purposes. And here's the eligibility outcomes. Roughly speaking, you're looking at the bottom couple of layers of Maslow's hierarchy of need, done in reverse. So you start with some just nuts and bolts basics, nutrition, hygiene, clothing, and you go on to more complex stuff. Have they got shelter, and can they use it safely? Relationships, work, education, being within the community, and parenting. Stuff to do with children sits within the Care Act, as well as the Children Act and the Children and Families Act. The Care Act and the most recent Children and Families Act were designed together to think about whole family work, you know. So the thing about these is these sorts of things, these first ones are fairly binary. Either the person can do it or can't do it. It's fairly obvious. As you go along, it becomes more subtle and nuanced around what these things mean. So if we ever make any errors in our judgments around these things as a local authority, the incidence of those errors increases as you go down this list, I would argue. And then those get out clauses that we look for as a local authority, because we're guardians, we're custodians of public money, we shouldn't be spending it unnecessarily. So what would be the reasons why we don't have to meet a need? 33B, the person doesn't want us to. That's a very obvious one, isn't it? 87, the need to be met by a carer. And in Care Act language, carer and care worker are not the same thing. Carer is somebody not paid, loved by a family member or a friend. Section 21 is a bit of a mouthful. Basically, is this destitution arising solely because of no recourse to public funds? This is likely to impact on asylum seekers and so on. Section 22, NHS needs to get on with it. Section 23, a local authority with housing responsibilities needs to get on with it. So in a two-tier area like Surrey, that'd be a district and borough council. So that's the theory. How's it going in real life? So 6 months ago, House of Lords Adult Social Care Committee produced a report, A Gloriously Ordinary Life. I love the name of that. That's what we should be aiming for people. I'll just show you a couple of extracts from it. Spoiler alert to what they think of it. That's the name of one of the chapters. So what do they say the problem is? They say the big problem is resources. So but that's not been, we can't address that in this context here. They say the other issue is you've got a policy change without a cultural change. So we should have moved on from that Griffiths report era thinking to this that description that's in the statutory guidance around doing things differently. That there's a culture change there. We haven't got there, and the problem they say is that statutory guidance. In part, you know, there's lots of elements to it, but the statutory guidance just that hasn't helped people do what they need to do. But that's bizarre, you say. You just read a nice bit of the statutory guidance that it described as culture change. How did it not happen? And what do they say about assessment? The House of Lords assessment should denote a collaborative exploration of what a good life would mean to this person, and not just be establishing eligibility for services. And the current guidance falls far short of reconceptualising care assessments in such a way. No, it doesn't, you say. We just saw it a minute ago, a few slides ago. It does a beautiful job of describing this. Well, it does and it doesn't. So that's, you're not expecting it to be able to read all of this. That's just it. Feel the width. That's the text from chapter 6 of the Care and Support Statutory Guidance, which is the chapter on assessment and eligibility. I've gone through it and I've highlighted bits for you there, the bits that actually talk about holistic assessment and envisage that culture change. This bit here is only relevant to parents of a child under 18. So for most of our purposes, it's not there. So it's just these bits, and that bit that I quoted to you is over here. So look at that. It's basically it's like looking at your calendar and you've made a lovely New Year's resolution with all good intent here, and you've just not stuck to it for the rest of it. This is not enough to support the culture change. It's not embedded. You get a few mentions of it, and all the rest is about purchaser provider split, market-based approaches to what we do. So that's the context. What did our work with Peter look like? I just want to show you a few bits. This is all stuff pre the period that looked at in the review, and none of this led to any real work from adult social care. There's a lot of referrals we had. You can see, you get a flavour. There was a lot of, it was bubbling up to attention in lots of instances. It's only tail into 2019 that any of this referral turns into our doing work. Why would that be the case? Because pre the end of 2019, pre-November 2019, for someone like Peter, the services that would work with him would be the integrated services, the social care and mental health integrated services that Surrey Borders ran. That integration came to an end towards the end of 2019, so the adult social care duties were pulled back from those integrated services and the work sat within our own organisation. So all these basically we passed on to Surrey and Borders integrated services. Surrey and Borders managed integrated services, but from 2019 into 2019 onwards, we kind of were involved with Peter up until his death, either our community-based teams or our prison-based teams for the spells he was in prison. So I want to show you a couple of bits of work that we did with Peter. So talking about that assessment process, you'll make sense of this. This is lifted off our recording system. This question here doesn't actually make sense. Is this need eligible? I think what this question is actually asking is it having a substantial impact on the person, because then it informs the eligibility decision. So look, here's a couple of those outcomes that we saw in that eligibility list, because this is all prescribed in law, so we have to show how we're complying with the public law. Here's the narrative on what we made sense of how he could or couldn't do these things, and then we said, yeah, he's got needs on this domain and they're having a substantial impact. There's 2 of them, so as you can work out, all 3 legs of the eligibility criteria are ticked, and that gets reflected in the outcome here. We're going to progress to a support plan. He has got eligible needs. We're going to have to write a support plan that shows how those needs are being met, either by us or if we can find a get out clause. So that was June 2020. January 21, we've got another assessment, and that's business as usual for us. We'll reassess people, we'll revisit our assessments at appropriate points. This assessment is word for word the same as the one 6 months previously, except for this one bit that changes. The outcome of the assessment, person not eligible. Should be needs not eligible. People aren't eligible, needs are. This person doesn't have eligible needs. But that doesn't make any sense, does it? Because the need hasn't changed. The impact it's having on his life doesn't change. The law hasn't changed. So the 3 criteria are met. So as a matter of public law, this is still a person with eligible care and support needs. So how can you make sense of that? What I think has happened here, and I've seen it elsewhere, and you can see it in local authorities up and down the country, is we got the law wrong. We did things out of order. Partly driven by a desire, I think, as lots of local authorities have, particularly in an age of austerity, of trying to get to, can we rule out that we're going to provide anything quickly? Because that's what happens in an age of austerity. We look for how do we save public money we don't have, by looking to rule people out from us providing services for them. So we did the assessment, and then we thought about, is there any reason for us not to meet an eligible need? And yeah, there was, because by now we've done a lot of work with him and said, here's what we can offer you, and he wasn't interested in anything we had to offer. So we took his turning down services, that 13.3b get out clause, as informing our eligibility decision. We got those 2 the wrong way round, and that had consequences. If we're thinking of ourselves, if that culture change hasn't happened, as the House of Lords say, we're still acting as a Griffiths area, as a purchaser of services. As soon as we're not purchasing anything, there's no reason for us to be involved. If we're not thinking that we're a Section 8 Care Act, counselling and other forms of social work provider, we're not going to think about that. And so erroneously in law, but rationally to us, we reached a conclusion that to our partners who were thinking they weren't dealing with a Griffiths era organisation, or probably not even thinking they're dealing with a Care Act organisation, people are probably thinking they're dealing with the CBAM report organisation, a nice social services department that isn't a reciprocal arrangement for the greater good of society. They're going to say, what the hell are you doing? This man needs you and you're walking away. So some of the key issues around this for us, that's the context in terms of the public law framework and how it's changed over years. But the other context is, this wasn't a one-off. This wasn't about a usually good practice for us slipping up in one instance. We could do this over and over again, so could every other local authority up and down the country, I would argue. I think another issue is Peter was a difficult person to work with. and that has psychological impact on people working with people who are chaotic and difficult, and we know what the psychology of decision making within a crisis emotional state feels like. You look for resolving the discomfort, resolving the psychic discomfort, even if your resolution to that is suboptimal. A quick way out of resolving the sense of crisis for us, unconsciously, I'm not saying anybody was thinking this intentionally, is well, we can close the case. Look, he's not eligible, we can close the case. And a bit, I think, for us around resolving that discomfort is helping people feel enabled and comfortable and confident and having the skills and knowledge around working with someone like Peter. Our substance misuse team, specialist services, brilliant at working with people with ongoing alcohol and substance misuse needs. Our mental health specialist teams are brilliant at working with people with long-term mental health issues. But it wasn't either of those teams that are working with them. It's one of our generalist locality teams, and I'm not sure that they feel that the same confidence in working with someone with the presentation that Pete had, and that has consequences for then how we chose to work with him. Okay, that's my bit.
Thank you, Clement. Everyone will have questions at the end of the session. Moving on now, Julie, if you could come and talk about the Surrey Adult Matters.
Yes, I can indeed. So, am I sharing? Can you all see that?
Not yet.
Right, okay, I'll come out. Not sure what's happened there.
They're there now, Julie.
Thank you. Okay, so my name is Julie Shaw, and I am the Senior Partnership and Programme Manager for Surrey Adults Matter. I think it's worth explaining that the start of Surrey Adults Matter really didn't go live until we were scoping and having a launch event at the beginning of 2020, but it kind of went live in April 2020, and Peter was one of the very first clients that we brought into what is an approach, not a service. And the briefing then was very different to the way that we work now, and the briefing that we have now for this approach. And there was just myself brought in to look at a cohort of around 20 adults with multiple disadvantage, which is an adult, for those not aware, multiple disadvantage is an adult experiencing homelessness, entering the criminal justice system, drug and alcohol issues, substance misuse, and mental health problems. So Peter was referred in early 2020 by Probation, and we were in our infancy. We were still learning about the Surrey landscape for adults with multiple disadvantage, so adults that fall through gaps in systems and services, and understanding what those gaps look like and what systems and what services, where are those gaps, to inform wider pieces of work in the future. Being an approach, setting up a model of delivery was one of the very first things that I was tasked with. And it had to be multi-agency, because collaboration with partners, information sharing, putting the client at the heart of the conversation was key. And we also were collecting quite a lot of data at that time, because that learning informed the way that we work with clients today. So since that time, there have been significant developments in the way that we approach our work. Notwithstanding, there are now additional resources. There is not just me doing this, which there was back then. There is now a whole team. So I think it's important to recognise that, and we've already heard that this case was being worked with at the height of the pandemic, which we all have to reflect back on and think about where we were professionally at that time, and what was our availability and what was our ability to have a face-to-face meeting with somebody. Equally, if somebody was not in Surrey at the time because they were hospitalised, arrested, incarcerated, what did that mean for us in the pandemic? Sam, in 2023, Surrey Adults Matter, where are we now? So right now, as I say, we have a team and it's becoming a multiple disadvantage team. There's quite a number of us. I haven't had a head count, but I think we're heading towards about 13 people in this team that now work solely on multiple disadvantage. Myself and my colleague Nicola are responsible for holding approximately 50 team around the person meetings per week. So the caseload has now grown. I think we're working actively with about 100 adults now with multiple disadvantage in a multi-agency capacity. And we continue to receive referrals. So casting our minds back to when that first cohort of 20 with Peter was being worked with, where we were trying to understand the system and how an individual with multiple and complex needs has to try and navigate their way around. We were also trying to educate the wider workforce, to say to the wider workforce, you need to come and join the party, you need to come and join the conversation here. We need you to come and talk to us about your experiences with this client so that we can all work together, look at what's working well, look at what's not working, and form that multi-agency action plan with the client at the heart. So that was really in its early days, and we were trying to embed that. So many of our services did not know who we were, what we were trying to achieve, because we were still in that education phase. Today, we have excellent attendance from, and this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but we have adult social care, Surrey Police, community mental health recovery, iAccess, the substance misuse teams in social care, probation, the housing teams, including housing associations, community safety teams, antisocial behaviour teams, supported housing providers, GPs, the care coordinators, hospital clinicians, alcohol liaison teams. We have consultant psychiatrists, prison staff, and the charity and voluntary sector, the clients themselves and their families, and advocates where appropriate. That is a general list of those people who now come to these meetings, and I can hand on heart say that that is not how it was looking back when we were doing this for Peter, because we were in our infancy. But now clients will often say that that team around the person, that multi-agency approach, is the only time their care is discussed with them. Clients have joined meetings from prison, from hospital, from mental health units, day centres, and from their own homes, often with a key worker or using their own devices. So regular presentations are made to adult social care teams. Now, that's generally because a team manager will contact me and say, please, can you come and talk to my team about what Surrey Adults Matter is? And that may be because a colleague has joined one of these meetings, found it extremely helpful, and has gone back and said, hey, you need to tap into this. That's a rolling programme because we have staff that join and leave regularly. So I have been working my way round. I do have social workers contact me quite a bit for advice on casework they have, or to discuss a potential referral. I also have given and continue to give regular presentations to probation, housing, community mental health teams, charm meetings, going to MAREC meetings, MAPA meetings, high harm perpetrator offender meetings, because several of our clients are prolific offenders. So since 2020, Surrey is now a changing futures area. So government funding from DLUC, £4.8 million was put forward to Surrey in funding for multiple disadvantage work. And that has meant the creation of trauma-informed assertive outreach, which we were piloting for a time, and the Changing Futures funding has allowed that to be expanded. And there are now around 10 charity and voluntary sector alliances with 20 specialist trauma-informed workers that provide outreach to Surrey Adults Matter clients and those with multiple disadvantage. And that's a fundamental shift, because that came from some of the early learning for clients like Peter, where I was able to establish very quickly that if you have multiple disadvantage and you are digitally excluded and you may have literacy and numeracy problems coupled with homelessness, health conditions, you need a support worker to navigate with you around the myriad of services and to ensure your health and well-being. So that is what we have now created for these individuals. In addition to that, because accommodation is a key thread throughout the Peter case, lack of or exclusion from or not eligible for. So we're piloting another initiative with the Forward Trust called a Hard to House initiative, sponsored by the Office of Police and Crime Commissioner, to try and get some clients that are not being accepted into supported housing or mainstream housing because of criminality or arson convictions or drug or alcohol problems. That is in its infancy, but it is something we're working on right now. And certainly towards the middle end of the pandemic, so very much after the Peter case, we brought in some temporary cabins as an emergency provision for COVID isolation. We brought those back and recommissioned them last winter to alleviate winter pressures, and many of our multiple disadvantaged clients were housed in there, which gave an opportunity for them, as Clement's discussed, you know, the Maslow hierarchy of need. And I think that was very much on my mind dealing with the Peter case, particularly around when we've spoken about the request for all these capacity assessments. I think at a TAP, we were all conscious of the fact that this gentleman had nowhere to live, and to understand his capacity to manage a tenancy, his capacity to manage his finances, we were hoping would give us an indication of what suitability, what type of housing would he be best in. Nobody had the answer. It seemed that he was excluded from most of the options that were being put on the table by the housing department. We wondered, would he be eligible for some funded care through social care and health, but we've heard about the issue around eligible needs. So we were very much trying to work from a strengths-based, you know, give this person the roof over their head and the warmth, so that all of the other things like the nutrition and health we can start to look at once that person feels safe. So having those cabins meant that for the individuals who were able to benefit from that, got exactly that. And move on was able to be arranged because they were assessed during that period they were in the cabins, and then signposted accordingly to the right accommodation provider. There is now embedded within this multiple disadvantage team for the staff that are working on the Changing Futures programme and the Surrey Adults Matter, a consultant clinical psychologist who not only provides the clinical supervision for the frontline alliance of outreach workers, but actually is somebody within Surrey and Borders that we can now refer to if we have challenges within the health system. And I had a meeting with her this morning as part of an escalation process on a case where the health aspect of a client is being bounced and nobody's taking responsibility. But, you know, there is something about neurodiversity and understanding, I think someone else has referred to a backstory, I think it was Fiona. What is the client's backstory? We are going back in time. What was early childhood experiences, adverse childhood experience, past trauma, things like fetal alcohol syndrome, undiagnosed cognitive impairments. Consultant psychologist is really helpful for us in establishing some of that. And in light of the case with Peter and looking at alcohol brain injury, and we did ask the question about Korsakoff's in the TAP, and I think at the time he was engaging with iAccess because that was very in and out. But the message was very much, you can't diagnose Korsakoff's without a period of sobriety because it won't show up on a brain scan. But then there was a disengagement by him with iAccess or a case closure by them. So very, very difficult to keep momentum going when you're trying to look at that. So some of the team have now gone on the blue light alcohol change ABI training. So what were the recommendations from the Safeguarding Adults Board and from this report for Surrey Adults Matter in particular, and how have they been implemented? So the recommendation was for guidance on the inclusion in TAP meetings of the adult, their carer, or people important to them. So we've always asked the question about how a client may be able to join a meeting, about extended family, friends that they trust, or an advocate. In relation to Peter's case, we did ask in the TAP about the inclusion of family members, and we were told that they were estranged. We were advised over the elderly mother, but that person would not be able to participate in meetings. And on reflection, I guess that question probably needed to be asked again, because it was quite a shock to then see in the review period that there were lots of family members involved and being discussed. And I think there may have been a period of time where Peter was estranged from family, but then those links may have been re-established. So what we did immediately, actually, after that became apparent, was to redesign the referral form so that actually when a referral comes into Surrey Adults Matter, we ask the referrer to put the names of family members, next of kin and contact details, so that if the client gives consent, we can actually contact them directly and invite them ourselves and have some dialogue with them during the process, because it's really important. We always do that, and most of the time we've got some link with family or friends throughout those meetings, but that also does include advocacy roles. We do have advocates that attend on behalf of clients or with clients and speak for them. Obviously the clients themselves are there and will articulate if they are estranged from family or do not wish family to be involved, but they will be involved. Guidance on the inclusion of health professionals within the TAP, particularly for those where there are concerns regarding ABI or cognitive decline associated with long-term substance misuse and alcohol dependency. So I'm now on the Combating Drug Strategy group. In the case of Peter, that strand was working well while he was engaging with iAccess, but then once he was disengaged and very transient in his accommodation, be that temporary accommodation, rough sleeping or prison, it became very harder to link in with some out of area services and to understand his medical needs. And our hospitals all use different digital information systems, so it is not easy to navigate or understand if someone's been admitted somewhere out of Surrey. We now have better links with the alcohol liaison nurses in all the hospitals, and also the Reconnect service for those leaving our prisons. We have created a TAP guidance for professionals, which will soon be uploaded onto the Healthy Surrey website and will now be disseminated as part of a referral pack. And the document outlines the expectations on partners involved in the TAP process and who will be invited to attend. But today, I think we are in a much better position, much stronger. There is a core body of professionals who are regularly involved with our multiple disadvantaged clients, and we have good representation. Guidance on when it would be appropriate for partner agencies to request and share with the TAP medical or legal expertise in respect of an adult's capacity to make decisions, especially if this is regarding care, treatment or residence. We've added that into this TAP guidance document as well. And in the case of Peter, those issues around mental capacity to make decisions specific to his circumstances was raised, and assessments were conducted several times, but with different outcomes. And we also spoke about fluctuating capacity, according to somebody's alcohol intoxication. And we still request this in our TAPs. I think I personally am much more confident in professional challenge, and we do have a pool of regular medical staff in the wider workforce now that are involved in TAP meetings, much more than we did in 2020 because of that service development and a much more business as usual approach. An escalation process to the SAM steering board that requires the swift involvement of a multi-agency, senior leaders and budget holders in resolving disputes or reviewing entrenched cases. So that was happening and had happened. And Peter was due to be one of those cases escalated in the days after his last prison release, but unfortunately his untimely death took place before it could happen. His case was escalated on a previous occasion during the pandemic when he was not offered accommodation as part of the COVID Everyone initiative. He was offered accommodation, but that very quickly broke down. Within the steering group, we have a risks and issues log where barriers and blocks in systems and services are regularly reviewed and actions are given to individuals and followed up regularly. how the Safeguarding Adults Board and SAM Steering Board will report emerging themes or safeguarding issues to the Health and Wellbeing Board, including issues arising from lack of resource, disputes or complaints, and how the Safeguarding Adults Board and Steering Board will disseminate key learning or system improvements back to frontline staff. Obviously, I can't speak for Safeguarding Adults Board, but I know that we've not had any disputes or complaints regarding the Surrey Adults Matter approach thus far. And we have included in our TAP guidance for professionals how any concerns might be raised and managed. Multi-agency risk assessments are now used for complex cases. So that's a live document completed within the TAP meeting for those really entrenched cases where we seem to be going around in circles, and they're reviewed and updated, particularly where risk might be escalating. Clients might also be referred into MAPA, where agencies agree this pathway if there's a public protection matter. We're currently developing a multiple disadvantage newsletter where emerging themes and key learning can be shared with frontline staff. So Surrey now has a multiple disadvantage team supporting adults with multiple and complex needs. The introduction of the Bridge the Gap trauma-informed outreach service has made a significant difference to how clients can engage better with systems and services when someone walks beside them. Clients can receive 4 to 8 hours a week of intensive outreach support. This was not available in 2020. We now refer clients leaving prison to the Reconnect service when they may have additional health needs and support to access healthcare when transitioning back into the community. This was not available in 2020. There is also now a duty to refer placed on prisons and hospitals. Clients with multiple disadvantage are less able to cope when given accommodation outside of Surrey. It is often setting them up to fail. We regularly see homeless multiple disadvantaged clients placed in bed and breakfast in London boroughs where they don't know anyone, they can't access support, and they're having to either travel back to Surrey to get that support or have their case transferred elsewhere. So that may mean a new probation officer, a new drug and alcohol service, a new landlord. It's setting them up to fail. This area of work needs greater collaboration with the housing departments and a pooling of resources for future use. So if we want to recommission cabins, for example, everybody's going to need to put some money in the pot. This is ongoing action for multiple disadvantage work. There is now a mental health and housing protocol between housing departments and Surrey and Borders in Surrey. It's now live. It ensures that no mental health hospital discharges are taking place without home treatment input and suitable accommodation. And in the TAP process, we now join ward round meetings as best practice and make sure that that protocol is being used. It's no point having a protocol if nobody knows about it, so we raise awareness and actually quote that when a hospital might be saying this person's ready to go, we'll say, okay, let's look at the protocol, what's the pathway here? And again, the access to that consultant psychologist now embedded in the team has made a huge difference. Okay, and that is me. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Julian, for updating on the implementation of the actions. Now moving along to the Hope Hub. We are slightly over time, but please appreciate my timings are completely out in the agenda, so please accept apologies for that. We will still have time for questions and a short break, but now moving on to Camilla, I think, from the Hope Hub.
Oh, yes, thank you. I'm Camilla Spicer, the Head of Service Delivery at the Hope Hub. Peter had been known to us since 2018, when we actually first opened our doors in May 2018 as a new charity. And at that time, it was just Mags and myself there doing casework. So I worked intensively. We both worked intensively with Peter to provide practical daily support. He was homeless. And we worked very intensely and closely with his probation officer at that time. Now moving on to 2023, we now have 17 staff members in the Hope Hub, of which 7 of those are caseworkers or outreach workers. So we have grown and changed quite substantially in that period. What I have done is looked at, following the SAR review, I've looked at the actions which we have implemented since then at the Hope Hub. So I will just read through, if that's okay, what what we have done, what learning outcomes we have taken from the SAR and what we have implemented. So we were part of the Bridge the Gap pilot, and following on from that, the Hope Hub were asked to become full members of the Changing Futures Bridge the Gap Alliance. And so now we have employed 3 members of staff to fulfil the agreed contract for full-time outreach posts covering Monday to Friday, 8 till 8, and Saturday mornings, 9 till 12. And within that, myself and Mags as the senior leaders form part of the strategic planning groups within the Changing Futures Alliance. So there's a lot of work being done there. And I know Julie has already talked through what that means, so I won't carry on anymore. Our outreach workers attend the TAP meetings. They're proactive in seeking senior management support to raise any safeguarding inquiries to ensure that a faster response to concerns and to avoid a delay in actions. And they will come to myself, they will come to Mags, and they will also go to Julie or Nicola as chair of the TAP meetings if there are any queries or concerns. So we now have implemented Outcome Stars as a learning tool, and a tool that we use to help us see where people are stuck, what support is needed for them. And all of any new service user coming to the Hope Hub will, within the first few weeks, will have an Outcome Star, and the team will work through and see what support and what intense support is needed for them. This is then reviewed on a quarterly basis, and it does inform relatively quickly of those who are stuck in certain areas of their life and need support to move on. And then using that as a tool, referrals are then made to either Bridge the Gap or Surrey Adults Matter and or other appropriate agencies to ensure that we can get the right support in place in a timely manner. Since Peter's review, we have had our emergency accommodation service in operation. That opened in January 2022, and that's in partnership with Surrey Heath Borough Council. And so that has opened as a night accommodation for 6 weeks for those Surrey Heath local connection residents who do not have priority need, and they're referred in via Surrey Heath, and they can come and stay in our nightly accommodation for 6 weeks. And our supervisor there works really closely with any of those tenants who come in to help them with tenancy support, and will be very quick at looking at their needs, using the outcome stars as well to see where they are stuck. And we'll ask and work with the housing officers to ask if supported accommodation is being looked at, and we'll put that through. We think this person needs supported accommodation. Can we work with you to put a referral in? So that's done in a timely manner too. All of the frontline staff have had trauma-informed care training, and as part of the Changing Futures, all our outreach workers on the Bridge the Gap team have had intense trauma-informed training in varying degrees in different areas of trauma-informed approaches, and they also have the access to the psychologist, which Julie has already talked about. Staff are more confident the challenge, and will seek advice from us to ensure that we're not looking at that service user cyclical patterns, revolving door behaviours, so that we can see what the issue is and what the problem is, and as I say, refer where needed to the right place. And following on from in more recent months, the Surrey Heath are now very active. We've got housing led in the borough. It's a new initiative, and that is now active, and both myself and Mags are on the panel for that and look at referrals coming in. And we also put in referrals and ask our team to consider housing led as another referral in for those who we see are revolving doors and stuff and need extra support. And the team are now very good at using the NTDs to look at high risk factors and see where, what are the high risk factors with certain service users, and we as senior leaders will then, before anything is submitted, will look through ourselves and have that second higher opinion and look through and draw out discussions and decisions with the team on why they're making certain decisions and actions. So also moving on, I, as the head of service delivery, continue to meet regularly with the housing solutions team manager on a monthly meeting. And I also, myself and her, also join Mags, the CEO, and the housing services manager for quarterly meetings, and that we meet regularly to discuss those who are homeless, rough sleeping, hard to place, or disadvantaged, to make sure that we are all aware of who is in the area and what are we doing to move them on and support them to move on. What we did highlight further improvements for us to consider are the following. So when concerns are highlighted about a service user, as was the case with Peter, we are satisfied that statutory bodies are listening to our concerns and we work together to find a solution. Another area to consider for improvement is there still remains a shortage of supported housing routes. And this would have been the best option for Peter and for others very similar. So we need to consider long-term planning for housing options for hard to place service users and those without the required local connections. For example, those with no recourse to public funds, those who have come in and haven't passed the habitual residency test. Where can they stay? Are we able to put them in our emergency accommodation? Is there a pod available? And is that something that we might be able to manage in the future? And I know that's something Julie's touched on as well. And NHS representation at the team around the person meetings are required, especially with the serious addiction risk and health, known and underlying health conditions. It's still very difficult to try and get various representation, medical representation. So, and again, training for all staff. We've had various different training, but it would be really good, I think, looking at recommendations 2 and 5, it would be good to have some further training from other statutory agencies, such as adult social care, so that our team are well aware of other responsibilities and roles within us as a cohort working together. Mags, do you want to add to that?
Thank you, Camilla. Hello, everyone. I think the only area really to add on from Camilla really is that I also attend quite a few meetings at strategic level with county, local authority, police and crime commissioner, NHS, and a whole range of others, which seeks to understand people with complex needs and multiple disadvantage and look to put in place strategic solutions. And I think on a national level, I know that there is a huge amount of work going on. And a lot of it came out, unfortunately, but also fortunately, during the COVID times, particularly with the NHS, when they became aware of the amount of work that charities like us were doing. You know, I remember COVID, it was basically everywhere was silent except the Hope Hub and the ambulances who placed behind us. And, you know, we remained open. We obviously worked with safe, good practice, etc. But people like Peter, you know, who accessed our services 1,285 times, you know, in a 4.5-year period, you know, that means really that all other bodies involved in Peter's case should also be liaising with us, because we were his go-to place. And when we would mediate with his family when, you know, there were difficulties and challenges and so on, and we'd help him to reopen those doors again. And I think that would be the biggest point that I would make is, please don't underestimate the value that charitable organisations like us, where we are providing essential crisis services, where people can get clothes, shower, meet the basic Hasler hierarchy of needs and good food. We served over 5,000 meals last year. You know, that's a scale of need in Surrey Heath. And to involve us, don't discard. When we raise red flags and concerns, we're doing it for a reason. And we are seeing this person face to face and know them probably better than the statutory bodies. So I think that would be my plea to all parties on people with complex needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Mags, and thank you, Camilla, for that really valuable information. So welcome back, everyone. Hope you managed to get a cool drink. We will going to have some time for quick time for questions now, and then Fiona will speak after that. There are a couple of questions in the chat, and hopefully you'll also be able to raise your hand. Looking at the first question from Maria, I think this is probably for you in adult social care, maybe, Clement. Potentially, it's around section 13 eligibility criteria. The person does not want us to. How does it apply to self-neglect and where the person's well-being and safety is seriously compromised?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding there. Section that issue around not meeting the needs if the person doesn't want us to is in section 13 of the Care Act, which is the section that talks about eligibility. But that decision comes after the eligibility determination. So we assess the need, decide if it's eligible or not, and then it's relevant whether the person wants us to meet that need or not. Yeah, for some people who neglect themselves and their well-being and safety is compromised, we might want them to accept help, but they're adults. They've got agency. Unless we can find a reason in law to go against their decision, which might be something like the Mental Health Act, something under the Mental Capacity Act, you'd probably be going to the Court of Protection in those kind of circumstances, getting a court order from the Family Division of the High Court. Unless we've got a mechanism to override somebody's choice, they're an adult who can make choices. So that's a dilemma that we often find ourselves in. The world will be saying to us something must be done, and we have to say, well, unless we can find the legal powers, that person is making a decision around how they live their life, which the rest of us might wish for better for them. But it doesn't change the eligibility decision. It changes what we do in about meeting that need.
Thank you. And there's a question from Julie Wadham regarding reasons for him not engaging. Anyone from the panel got thoughts on why we think he wasn't engaging?
I would probably challenge whether he wasn't engaging. He came, as Mags and Camilla said, almost daily to their services. He struggled to meet the expectations of services, and that's something slightly different. It's thinking about it in the context of how we work, which is why this Surrey Adult Matters and the team around the person is so incredibly valuable. I'm going to let Dr. Raja come in because I don't want to give the expectation or the perfect means that everybody has to flex, but there are still expectations for services to meet the wider need, as Clement said. But there is within law the opportunities for people to make adjustments, reasonable adjustments in those, in order to be for services to be designed around actually what does help people to engage, if that makes sense. Dr. Raja, did you want to come in?
Yes, so you're right. I don't think he was disengaged, but nor that he lacked opportunities to engage. But certainly the kind of the appropriate fix in terms of his needs and what services could offer wasn't there at all points. I think one of the important factors in this is that his continuing use of alcohol, which unfortunately did not help. And I think I'm so sorry, I'm struggling to talk over the voice that's in the background. So all of us would recognize that there are different phases of alcohol-related engagement, and I think he was in the pre-contemplative phase, as in that he was not at that point where he could contemplate about the importance of either cutting down his drinking to an acceptable level or being totally abstinent and starting to engage in work towards that. And therefore that made a significant difference in terms of how he came across when he was engaging with any service for that matter. And clearly the repeated use of alcohol would have also diminished his ability to cognitively process some of the support that was being offered to him. So I don't think it was a want of trying, even on his part. I just think that it's so unfortunate that alcohol made such a huge impact on his abilities to engage in a fruitful way.
Thank you. The second part of Julie's questions is regarding, I think it was to adult social care, Julie, correct me if I'm incorrect, but would you consider reassessing given his condition of alcohol addiction and change in presentation?
We've got we've got a statutory duty to reassess. Section 27.
I suppose the question is, did you reassess?
We did several assessments, but his alcohol use was never a trigger for a reassessment because the alcohol use was already existing the first time we did an assessment, so that wasn't a trigger in its own right. The test in law is if there's a change in circumstances that would merit a reassessment. So the mechanism is there in law. There's a statutory duty to reassess if it's required.
Thank you for that. So I think that's all the questions from the chat. If we move on now to Fiona, who's sort of got the closing session. Thank you.
No problem at all. Bear with me. Hopefully people can see my slides. Is that right? Excellent. So just to sadly, Peter's case is not unique. As we've all kind of alluded to, there are lots of cases and lots of safeguarding adult reviews, lots of thematic reviews where this is an area. So this is an area that's been focused on. We've talked about multiple disadvantage. King's College University have done a huge amount of study around multiple exclusion homelessness. It's very similar. In fact, it's just an interchangeable term. I met with them this week, in fact, to talk about this case and this SAR, because they're particularly interested at the moment around that issue that Clement brought up around agency. If somebody has agency, and we should all be striving towards giving people agency, that is what good social work, that is what good multi-agency intervention is about. That's what we talk about when we mean about rehabilitative support, rehabilitative care. How does that impact? Previous studies from King's College have identified 5 common barriers, all of which were pretty relevant in this case. So the cooperation, coordination, leadership, lack of professional curiosity or normalisation of risk, or as Mags alluded to, that disparity that sometimes happens amongst practitioners. Actually, if you've got a team around the person and they've got equal, what they're saying should have equal weight. Traditional access routes to assessments do not work, as that has been very clearly, and the lack of suitable provision is also a very significant issue in Surrey as it is elsewhere in the country. I think we can work on now without that magical money tree, although I do hope one day that sprouts. Is the last one around that kind of, so the cooperation, coordination, leadership, Julie and her team and, all the agencies that are involved in that will take that forward. The professional curiosity, that disparity, that trying to make sure that we're not normalising risk is going to be crucial. But the core contingency planning to prevent the escalation of need is a really critical one. Clement has been very clear about the fact that there is nothing within the Care Act that compels or that gives the local authority power to compel somebody to accept support. What there is duties to continue to offer assessment, to continue to offer that good social work. So in a situation like Peter's, where you've got somebody who has been assessed, who has eligible needs, who is saying, no, I don't want your help, or is not actively engaging in the offers of help that have been there, that offer that you talked about, Clement, of that continual social work, because the conversations he was having with his social worker from the CMHT were really positive conversations. I think he sometimes got quite a lot out of that from what I could read. This is what we know good looks like from all the research that's come out. Direct work must start early. It must include the adult at risk. Your SAM processes show that. And then you plan for contingencies. You plan for foreseeable challenges. The TAP need to know and apply a wider legal framework. They need to respond to safety and care needs. Working through what the likely barriers are going to be because of a lack of poor, insufficient accommodation, inability of an individual to, because of their cognitive functioning or because of where they are in terms of their own recognition of the risks that alcohol poses for them. Being really proactive about those continuity of care duties, really thinking about what that means and pre-planning for that is really crucial. And as Julie's talked about, as others have talked about, that organisational support and ensuring, as Mags and Julie do, that actually feeds into that strategic decision making and governance at the top is crucial. It'll be much easier to argue for the funding for new resources and for those assertive outreach if we have a body of cases that says that this is what works. I'm not going to talk you or read you through these slides, but I wanted to highlight the approach that you take in Surrey is consistent with what those 6 safeguarding principles say and what all the good practice says around kind of what needs to happen. What we're talking about here is not redesigning everything so that we take away people's agency, not trying to ensure that somebody isn't in, to take away all risk. What we have to have is a sensible risk appraisal. What we have to do is work collegiately, given the resources that we have, and engage with the family and engage with the voluntary sector. It's been so great to read some of the comments about can we be involved in the TAP? Building on the work that's gone on is fantastically important. Hayden's judgment in the Tower Hamlets case is a warning to us all around our healthy and moral human instincts to try and protect people from unwise, potentially catastrophic decisions. We cannot eclipse their fundamental right to make their own decisions if they have capacity to do so. And I think that's really crucial. I've set out the stuff around the prevention duty, the protection, what that means in the context of disadvantaged multiple exclusion homelessness. Knowing how the statutory duties in the Care Act interface with the Housing Act obligations, interface with health obligations is incredibly empowering, incredibly supportive. I've given you references to the Homelessness Code of Guidance, to be thinking about clinical vulnerabilities. Frequently he was seen initially, Peter, as not having capacity to manage a tendency to engage with, and that meant that he couldn't be offered accommodation. There were other times when he was not seen as in priority needs, or rather that he was seen as intentionally homeless as well. Considering that clinical vulnerability is really, really crucial too. In terms of proportionality, this is just the joy of the Care Act is that it's a two-pronged approach. There is that duty to offer advice, assistance, to offer care and support when it's there. And then there is that duty for a multi-agency response where even when all of that is offered, an individual is likely to be somebody with care and support needs at risk of abuse or neglect, including self-neglect, and they're unable to protect themselves. Self-neglect will not always require a Section 42 response, but what Section 42 offers is, again, alongside the Surrey Housing Matters, that opportunity to really bring people together to think about how you work collectively to reduce the risk. And I've given in the this final bit about unable to protect themselves, just that differentiation. What struck me, having done this for years and years and years, I mean, I've been training on the Mental Capacity Act since since before it came into law, but it took Peter's case for a light bulb to kind of come on, that actually the duty of care in respect of safeguarding, the Section 42 duty, talks about unable to protect themselves. It doesn't necessarily require a capacity assessment. So I think taking in, but sorry, what I mean by that is the Section 42 focus is on, can this person keep themselves safe? So even where you have somebody with agency, with capacity, in that high risk situation, the structure of the Care Act, as Clement, your history lesson was superb, absolutely superb. For somebody who didn't come into social care or to this line of work as a social worker, it kind of helps contextualise. But what it does, Section 42 and Section 11.2, is it permits us to continue to offer, to continue to be involved in that person's life, and to be constantly asking them to say, about, do you understand why I'm concerned about the level of this well-being? And really try and think about what it is that's preventing them from being able to recognise and protect that risk. In terms of the partnership work and that cooperation duties, that's in statute. So there is a really clear obligation for relevant partners, including the police, DWP, health and housing, to cooperate whenever they're using their functions. And accountability has been, Clement has spoken much more eloquently than I around the public law principles of fairness, and thinking about actually how we utilise mental capacity law, human rights, equality duties to really think about flexing and working collectively together. Self-neglect is an area that's incredibly difficult. We all learned in COVID just how wide those public health laws are, and how they're not really very focused on capacity when we couldn't go out for 3 months, regardless of our capacity. And that's because it is specifically looking at that wider public health, that protection to the public. Mental capacity law is about agency, and if somebody doesn't have agency, how we as a service are, as services, act as that safety net, working in their best interest, not in the interests of organisations. And then the Care Act, the Care Act and the Housing Act are all able. We saw in Peter's case how the Housing Department flexed the Housing Act and utilised powers that were given to them with the Homelessness Reduction Act to ensure actually he was accommodated as quickly and as frequently as was possible. It was often just that thing. So bear in mind that each practitioner and each area of practice will come at an issue with their own priorities, with their own set of legal restrictions sometimes, or at least parameters. And actually that the power of a team around the person is having that open conversation about how far can you go, what do we need from you, how can we do this, Clement's thing around, why do we not have to do it as a local authority, because a carer might be able to do that. Well, if actually Peter was accepting a huge amount of support from the Hope Hub, it was then thinking about, so what else is it that social care can provide? And as I say, the conversations he had with his social worker were in the main really supportive. Had they carried on, that might have facilitated that him moving into that space that Dr. Raja was talking about, where he recognised the next steps he needed to take. All of this is possible in terms of ethical practice. A while back now, I worked with Bruno Onalays, who runs a very similar project to the Hope Hub up in Stoke, on a gift to our 20-year-old selves, we called it. Effectively, it was a toolkit for practitioners working with multiple disadvantage, thinking through how you articulate needs in a way that reflects the outcomes from the Care Act, but also the health needs that so often this client group have. Is designed around 3 questions. Have you somewhere safe to sleep tonight? Do you understand why I'm concerned about the level of your well-being? So that capacity and that agency issue can be really explored, but in the context of everybody's duty of care. And then what help do you need to protect you? So it becomes person-centred to that person's. It gives lots of links to other brilliant tools like autism and homelessness, like working with pregnant women who are homeless. There's brilliant tools out there. And then the final slides, given the timing, are just my advice after so many of these reviews and so many years of practice and reading stuff around what I think frontline staff with care assessment, care treatment and protection planning responsibilities might need to think about. The most important would probably be a focus as a team around the person on bringing all of that brilliant assessment, all of that brilliant multi-agency planning into one accessible document that can travel, that can go with an individual. All too frequently in reviews, we see that there's been so much good work and it falls down, as it did with Peter, when something unexpected happened. So when he was brought back to prison and then released with very little warning, that consistency was made much, much harder. So if there's one thing that I would say, do this because it would make a difference, is actually bring that complex risk care assessments into one place, make them accessible. We do that in learning, in respect of learning disabilities in terms of health passports and things like that all the time. And given the complexity and given how hard often it is for those with multiple disadvantages to articulate their needs in a crisis situation, the learning that we've taken from LD is really directly transferable and could make a huge difference from people. I know it's a bit early, but I'm gonna sort of pause there because you'll get the slides and they are available. This last slide is probably just setting out if you do need to escalate, if you have got a concern that you think actually even with all of this we need to, how it might be a good structure to articulate your concerns when you're looking to pull that together as a team around the person or to get that referral in. But of course, Julie's referral form is pretty much shapes this, I suspect. But yeah, so it's just hopefully a guide to, I suppose, what I've learned in the last 20 or 30 years working in this sector. I think we've got a few minutes if people do want to ask any other questions, and I'm happy to take them. But, you know, I'm also always happy to let people go to an earlier lunch break than they were expecting to. Sarah.
Does anyone have any questions? You should be able to raise your hands, hopefully.
I think Julie's put a question in the chat about engagement with Hope Hub service due to the fact he was familiar to people and felt safe and also understood what they could support him with.
It was just a comment, really. I think that's what's coming through to me is that he felt safe there. He's probably getting to see consistent people. He understood what the support that they would give him. So that was really good to hear. Does that? And I think sometimes when people have their assessment from social care, what that looks like, perhaps sometimes they don't understand what the support at the end of it would look like to them. Does that make sense? Whereas he's going to the hub all the time, or Hope, and he understands the support that they're going to give him each time because it's quite consistent.
The other side of it as well, if you don't mind me saying, is that the whole approach is non-judgmental, whereas when statutory services come in, they have to make a judgment.
Yeah.
And actually, sometimes, even though we as professionals might not, we deliberately try from a trauma-informed perspective to take that out of the equation, past experiences will also inform somebody's a view as to what. So it is often the case where people have had. That's why it's called some other places multiple exclusion homelessness. If you've been excluded from services for a long period of time, you are less likely to re-engage or engage in the way that people expect it to happen. And I think that's why you'll find that they will still access services that they feel are non-judgmental. But that's not a reflection of the practitioners that work in other sectors, if that's helpful.
Julie, do you want to come in there?
I just think if we look at his last day, the two things that resonate for me are the fact that he was as I've alluded to in my presentation, you know, expected to go and live in Datchet in a room on his own with no support. But for him, the reason he was travelling by train that day was to go back to the Hope Hub to access the support and the friendships that he had there, and you know, the meals and all of the services they provide. And then, you know, somewhere between leaving there and getting back on the platform, he's intoxicated because he's travelling back to go and sit on his own in a room. And I think that for me resonates in terms of the out of area accommodation placements for this group, because were his accommodation in Surrey, we may not have been where we are. That's just a takeaway thought from me. The importance that the service he got from the Hope Hub had for him. He was prepared to travel from Datchet to Camberley. So yeah.
Thank you for that. I think we're at a closure now because I know people are leaving. So I want to thank everyone who's come to attend this learning event in relation to the Safeguarding Adults review for Peter, but also to thank our speakers. We've heard from lots of different agencies who are involved in Peter's life, and also some of the learning and how the learning been taken forward by agencies. But we would welcome attendees taking any learning you feel relevant back to your own services. I think there is different learning for different areas. The slides and webinar will be available on the board's website next week. We also have a feedback form at the top of the chat, so we'd welcome you feeding back if possible. And I think that's all. So can I please thank you all again? Thank you for our speakers, and we will be in touch.